Hello, friends, fellow deviants. For those who know me through Deviation, the journal and its accompanying ethical framework for navigating ill defined moral terrain. Thank you for tuning in. This is Topography, a podcast exploring the contours of design spaces, be they physical, social, digital, or purely imagined. I'm Ashley Hoden. This is the first episode in a series that is loosely tethered to the fields of landscape architecture and urban design. Since these professions are so closely intertwined with some of the most pressing and controversial issues of the 21st century, my aim in establishing Topography is to hold meaningful dialogue with some of the leading academics and practitioners as a way to highlight their work and to hopefully contribute to the greater discourse within the landscape architectural realm. Kicking off this series is a talk with Casey Lance Brown. Casey is a landscape futurist whose work pushes urban design into a much broader sphere than just about anyone else I've encountered. From mapping potential habitats for Colossal, who is seeking to reintroduce the woolly mammoth, working with Toyota Research Institute on autonomous mobility efforts, studying economic speculation in Rome, or efforts to potentially mine asteroids in space, to producing fine art photography related to kudzu vines and their historic use, or derelict drive-in theater screens. He goes where curiosity takes him, and it takes him very far. He has published many papers and visual features in other publications. His art has been shown in a wide array of galleries as well. He graduated summa cum laude from Duke University, where he majored in art history and minored in earth and ocean sciences. He also earned a master's in landscape architecture from Harvard GSD, graduating with honors and being awarded the Charles Elliott Traveling Fellowship. He is a Rome Prize Fellow and frequent guest lecturer and critic among numerous universities and art institutes. He was also the director of design research at the P-Rex Lab in MIT for many years. Okay, Casey Lance Brown, welcome to Topography. Thanks for agreeing to talk with me.
Thank you for having me. This is great.
Yeah, absolutely. I've read LA Plus quite a bit, and I've read all three of your articles. And just in wanting to do this podcast, it seems like there's space for something like this related to landscape architecture. And your work is so expansive. It seems, I just read the article about speculation in Rome, and then there's also mining in space. And then the work you're doing with Colossal, art shows. And so I wanted to just start maybe by asking about your practice in general and how you've kind of come to take landscape architecture into such an expansive realm.
Well, I suppose it partially comes down to I'm just never satisfied. Every subject just seems to filter and run into the next subject, and I can't seem to stop my curiosity, and so it just sprawls into other arenas, and I just encompass them the best I can. Some of it comes down to like two big concepts for me. One's the overview effect, which is often sort of talked about in reference to space. And how once you get above the earth and you see like the atmosphere line or something, you begin to think in terms of systems instead of details or singular units or something that's reducible to a smaller unit. And I've always just been highly influenced by that, maybe because I'm from a mountainous area, so I'm used to being kind of on top of things and seeing a broad view. And then on the other end is a thing called root cause analysis. It comes from engineering, but it really just means digging down through the layers to try to understand why something happened, usually a problem, so that you don't treat the symptoms and you go fully to the root and the base of what's causing whatever phenomena that you're studying or problem that's occurring. And so between this uber high view and this kind of buried deep earth view, I'm always cycling between the two and then trying to meet in the middle on something that really clarifies why we see what we're seeing in the world as a phenomena.
Yeah. I I I like that. I like the idea of working from a systems level approach and then honing in on specific issues in relation to the greater whole and how all these interlocking systems kind of feed each other in either causing or resolving a problem. So I maybe jumping into one of your projects as a way to unpack that idea of working from a systems approach and addressing specific issues. I'm curious about what you're doing with Colossal, the rewilding and bringing back the woolly mammoth. I was looking at the maps that you prepared, and it looks like there's 4 main places where they're looking to do this.
Well, that's even just one of the first investigations of imagining what we're going to bump up into in the world, right? If anything like this is implemented. So it's a kind of way of sort of spit testing where might the largest benefit be and where can we avoid kind of conflicts or difficulties. And one of the main issues is soil carbon and the potential for permafrost melting. Because the idea is that these mega herbivores actually affect the land so significantly that they might be able to hold more permafrost and thus keep the carbon entombed in the soil. So one of the first investigations was to assess where the highest soil carbon was in the Arctic. And that's what those initial map investigations were about, was finding those spots, then checking their adjacencies, checking the jurisdictional issues, checking the environmental issues, and seeing if there might be a sweet spot, right, that meets all the criteria at once. We've already jumped into a much more advanced study right now, and I can't talk about it much, but we're looking into the very, very serious issue of estimating capacity, looking even farther into the future, and how these herbivores might truly interact with the environment in terms of forage availability, nutrient availability, specific ecological landscapes that they could benefit from and also benefit.
God, that's wild. So, in terms of capacity, like in enhancing the carrying capacity of the land at large, or the capacity of them simply being able to survive on these areas?
Great question.
Or both.
Both.
Yeah.
That's right. Both. There's this beautiful feedback effect that happens with mega herbivores that is currently missing in the Arctic, right? We used to have woolly rhinoceros, giant bison, and of course mammoth and mastodon running around. And they eat so significantly, right? So like 2% of their body mass, for example, which can be hundreds of kilograms a day.
God.
And so they consume all these materials, these forbs, herbs, grasses, etc. And then they could travel, extremely far. So like, let's say 50 kilometers they could cover in a day. And then they excrete, right, the seeds that they just ate in a new space, along with a load of fertilizer. So you end up fertilizing larger sort of spatial coverage with these, say, forbs from one area and putting them into another area and actually enhancing the carrying capacity of the land.
It's so amazing. And this is leveraged by technological advances, like the ability to resequence the DNA? Is that part of it of the woolly mammoth from
Absolutely.
fossils?
More importantly, to very precisely with a system called CRISPR
Hmm.
target particular gene segments and then put them in a proper sequence to help adapt a, say, Asian elephant genome, which is roughly 99% similar to a woolly mammoth, toward a woolly mammoth's genome, which we have versions of. But it's hard to get a perfect set of genome because genetic material is very unstable and it degrades very quickly in the environment.
God, that's phenomenal.
So things like subcutaneous fat, they need that, right, to survive the Arctic.
Hmm.
Hair production, which is just an insulator, etc. Um, Certain ways of probably circulating blood to be sure things, parts of your body don't freeze. All these, they've already identified the genetic sequences that provide some of these um, adaptive traits, and then they're going to place them into the genome.
It's so amazing. So from what I saw on the website, is that this has been, built off decades of research and development.
That's right.
And then how one thing that I was curious about was how it does help preserve the carbon that's in the permafrost. Is it from trampling the ground and kind of compacting the earth through movement, or is it also part of fostering the wildlife? The planting the seeds and the
Yeah.
nutrients through their
It's
just
actually it's
existence.
multiple pathways are possible, and of course they all have to be tested. Um, but the idea is that partially through trampling, partially through a combo of trampling and eating and crushing shrubbery and small trees, because shrubbery and small trees, interestingly, you might think that they shade the Arctic and it makes it colder, but in fact, because they're dark green and because probably they emit just a tiny amount of energy, they actually warm the soil and the surrounding environment. And that actually melts it and tends to have less ice, less accumulation of permafrost. So by removing those plant materials, which only big animals can do, you turn the land back over into a kind of grassland state, which allows the atmospheric cold to enter the soil and hold the frozen state.
So were these the trees that have arrived? Have they come? Are they mainly only able to exist because the large mammals have been removed or have died?
And that's a great question, and there's no easy answer to that. There
Hmm.
currently an enormous debate over they basically call it shrubification of the Arctic, and it's happening, and it's partially happening because of climate change. More
Hmm.
warmth, more solar exposure means more growth. So we do have that happening, but yes, there's this other much more complicated pathway that does happen through mega herbivores, where we think that in fact they would be maintaining that environment in a different state, right? So it's called a trophic cascade, right? And it cascades across the environment all the way down to the soil, changing the nutrients, the cycling, the solar radiation, the types of species, etc., all in a system pushing what is a kind of, say, shrubby environment much more toward a barren grassland environment.
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So stepping back then and looking at this systems aspect of this, and the work that you're doing in that capacity, are you analyzing then, looking at, let's say, the globe as a whole and selecting regions? You mentioned that part of it was areas where it's more important to preserve the permafrost because of the amount of carbon that will be released. Are there other sort of like ecological systems aspects to what you're including in the analysis? Um,
Absolutely. Um, and this is kind of ongoing, so I can't really go
mhm.
too far into it. And I will also note that Colossal has been so open, I think, and supportive of any element that benefits conservation. They're pretty focused on keeping that available and being and showing their work and saying, hey, if this benefits, we're willing to share it, etc. The company itself mostly is going to work through the genetic engineering component, and the conservation and sort of ecological benefits are just really co-benefits of that process. Obviously, we're looking at the kind of species assemblages that might propagate down the trophic cascade if a mega herbivore was around, and how that might alter things, benefit diversity. There's a really interesting concept called intermediate disturbance theory, and it's this idea that stasis for an ecosystem, right, is actually not that productive. Neither is total destruction. In between is that kind of intermediate, a little bit of damage, a little bit of opening up of the solar system, a little bit of flooding, etc., opens ecological niches for several more species or species assemblages to thrive. And so you get a more biodiverse, more complicated ecosystem, more productivity out of that disturbance.
I love that. I think of just in terms of even business organizations or school structures or just any sort of human agency or some group of people working together. There's this tension between perfect functioning order where it loses its creative capacity. You just kind of show up and it almost just everything happens on its own. You play your role and then you have like, I think of Apple or Tesla or something with like Steve Jobs or Elon Musk, who are known for just coming in and throwing this chaos into the equation, and it bubbles up all these new and innovative ideas, and the notion that happens in an ecological framework is just so cool. And it makes me think also, I guess I think it was, I'm forgetting who the author was, but she was writing about the forests in Malaysia, Indonesia, and how they were, historically came about from an interplay with human farming and working with what existed there just sort of naturally. And I guess that's the same case with the Amazon too, is that they're starting to realize how much human history is involved in the Amazon's existence, just period.
The the new Amazon research is crazy with LiDAR, et cetera. So you can sort of peer through, and we're clearly noting that there's these large civilizational structures, right? And I think the most interesting thing that's going to come about from that work is if we can better define those tipping points between, say, savanna and tropical rainforest, and whether ancient civilizations have impacted that and controlled that tipping point. Whether we are, I mean, I think it's pretty obvious that we are, but did they? And that's a really big question right now for me. We often talk so, I think, naively about old civilizations as if they didn't have like enormous sophistication, but also enormous impact on the land.
Yeah. I'm so with you on that. It's, to me, one of the most fascinating things. Yeah. Like it's like our history, our entire history has been presented in such a limited way. Yeah. And when you think of, I don't know the exact numbers, but like humanity's been around for hundreds of thousands of years, essentially, in our general current biological condition. And that if you think that just in the last 10,000 years, post Younger Dryas, the development that has occurred, imagine prior to that, if you're thinking hundreds of thousands of years, what could have come and gone? To me, it's so fascinating. It just opens up such a more complex and interesting picture of who we are. And it reshapes even just environmental discourse.
Yeah.
Like you say, where the impacts from the past could be just so much more massive than what we understand if we're looking at it as sort of like a pristine Earth pre-man.
Yeah. Yeah. Purity is a very polluting concept, in my opinion.
Totally, I completely agree with you. Yeah, yeah, and so in addressing big picture issues, I think it that's particularly where that can be the case because it can drive horrible policy about
Hmm.
addressing climate change. Like
Precisely.
like in Sri Lanka, they just recently just one day they announced you can't import uh, fertilizers and pesticides, and it
Yeah.
just they're starving. They're
Yeah.
um,
It'll be hard.
yeah, and so there's that balance between like just ignoring the fact that temperatures are warming, coastal cities are going to be flooded, things like that,
Hmm.
or just imposing like the harshest, severest measures based on the idea of maybe like a purity method of doing
Hmm.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like the 20 years we were having these arguments about um, ecological restoration, right? It was kind of becoming a kind of big concept of how we might go about reeling back some of the damage that we've caused industrially, civilizationally, agriculturally. And just immediately, the question is restore to what point?
Yes.
100 years ago, 500, 1,000, the last ice age? They're all different.
Yes.
um, but we seem to still just kind of sit so simplistically and naively at thinking that we can just kind of erase our guilt by getting rid of a few things that we changed, rather than looking at the system as a complex, evolving, messy, um, sometimes damaging system. A lot of people don't know that, like acid rock mine drainage, it's a real problem for mines when you open up soil, expose certain rocks, especially sulfurous rocks, to water. It
Mm-hmm.
drains out sulfuric acid and it kills everything. It's terrible. But many people don't know that many natural drainages, natural springs, and earthquakes can cause the exact same phenomena.
Yeah. I
It's
would.
completely natural.
Is that part of Yellowstone? I haven't been, but I've understand that the geysers themselves have like a sulfuric nature to them. And you smell the sulfur and
Yeah.
huh.
Yeah, I mean, almost anything that emits out of the earth is going to emit some hydrogen sulfide, and yeah, you'll smell it. Um, it's all about the chemistry. Each one varies quite a bit, but if you see colors in the water, that's mineralization of metals, and very likely it's very toxic to most things. But usually there's some obscure type of archaea bacteria that thrives on it. In fact, um, and it's just kind of like, which life are we going to support? Because life's complicated.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Do you find with Colossal that there is a faction of conservation that would just is completely against this idea of
You mean outside Colossal?
yeah, not within Colossal, but
Yeah, yeah,
in relation to the work being
yeah.
done, and if there
Mm.
are some outside forces looking at it, and particularly under this lens of like
Yeah,
conservation returning to some pre, you know, human or some
yeah.
more original
Well,
state.
well, let me just note first to be very clear that I don't want to I am not a spokesman for Colossal, and I'm not an employee either. I'm very supportive of their effort, and I'm a consultant, and I try to enhance what they're doing because I think it's um, the new frontier that we need to be working on. Um, but
Yeah, that's
if you
I
do
think
look in the media quite a lot, there's massive backlash to Colossal. None of it's very structural yet, because of course Colossal hasn't physically changed anything just yet. It's mostly lab work right now. Uh, but that's what I love about her. It's a moonshot.
Yeah.
There's a lot of work to get there. It's a bold vision, but to me, they're doing it right. And I really appreciate how open they've been with their information, that I'm sort of part of their information operation, right? Like I try to match their vision with real data and the potentials in the future with my knowledge of landscape systems. And they've been very supportive of trying to find ways to propagate that information through the web, through talks, obviously, and I think it's great.
Yeah. No, I think it is important also to note that your role there, that you're
Yeah,
a separate consultant. Yeah. Um,
and I play that role always. So my work on mobility with Toyota Research Institute, no, not the car company, but the Research Institute of the car company, as well as Toyota Motor Foundation. These are like nonprofit efforts outside of the company, and then I am a consultant to them. I do not work within them, and that way I don't absorb their biases, and that's to help them, right? So that I have a true independent voice for them. Same thing
yeah.
with universities, anybody I work with.
Well, I didn't know about this work at Toyota. You're doing work related to mobility.
Well, that work comes through MIT with a partnership I have with Alan Berger, who's a professor at MIT, and founded a lab called PREX. And we are one of the major topics that we worked on for a long time was mining, both pre-mine planning but post-mine reclamation. And then later we continued that work, but then we transitioned to mobility and trying to predict the future of urban developments, suburban developments, and autonomous driving. And he's the founder, he's the director of that lab, and I sort of head up the research component. I have been gone from that active work for a few years, but for about a decade we worked on that.
God, that's wild. It's funny. I've so often with landscape architects, people kind of, you tell them that's what you do, and then they equate it to like gardening or doing some sort
Yeah.
of. And the idea that you're working on autonomous vehicles through the route of landscape architecture to me is fascinating. What
Well, go ahead.
I was just going to ask what it entailed. What kind of work went into that?
Well, let me also back out and just talk about the way I see that limited lens that you're talking about, that most people see landscape architecture through. I usually just stop and use the word landscape because there's something, and it isn't that I don't like architecture. I love architecture. That's probably how I got into landscape architecture. But it's that landscape has that dynamism, and it includes all the topics, right? Ecology, human systems, civilizational systems, engineering systems, constructed systems, and it keeps it in the conversation. But I always like to go back to, say, Olmsted. Like so many students are taught Olmsted as if he was a type of style that happened way back in the 1800s, and it has something to do with curvy paths and fake nature. That's not the interesting part of Olmsted at all. The interesting part of Olmsted is that he was a scientific farmer, he was a publisher, he was the head of the sanitation engineering of the U.S. Army during the Civil War.
Whoa.
And that he is, a major founder of the field of U.S. forestry. He is a major founder of the idea of the national park systems. And his ideas through his sons are the founding of American U.S. planning, the field of planning. And when you think of all those topics, scientific farming to publishing, all the way to planning of urban systems as well as national park systems, that's the landscape that I study. And I think that the professionalization and over-specialization of all fields really restricts that original broad vision that I adhere to.
That's really well put. Yeah. The term landscape itself is typically read as almost having like an aesthetic nature to it. Like there's this, like it goes back to like the separation of man and nature kind of idea, and
Precisely.
I really like the reframing and putting it in this bigger context. Yeah.
Yeah, and we were talking earlier about sort of lack of sort of trying to distance ourselves from purity, that we can all go back to this previous state where we didn't interact or we didn't change things. And like I always like to use biological examples. So like if you think about legumes, right, like peas or kudzu, that store and fix nitrogen in nodules in the soil. Well, they store and fix nitrogen by farming a bacteria. The bacteria live in the nodules that the plant provides, and they actually interpenetrate the tissues of the plant. They don't live that well, they don't function as well outside of those nodules. So the plant is really farming the bacteria. To me, that is an interventionist action, not that different than our own farming and our own civilization.
That's
They are
amazing.
exploiting resources to better adapt and better occupy space. I'm pretty sure that's what we do.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I had no idea. So they using
Yeah.
nitrogen fixation, they
Yep.
create their own sort
So
of.
no, the bacteria. So like plants normally can't fix nitrogen. It's not available to them. That's
Mhm.
why nitrogen fertilizer is in a certain form that makes the plant grow so well. But legumes are a class of plant that um, endosymbiotically partner with bacteria called rhizobium, from rhizome, right, in the root system,
Mhm.
to fix nitrogen to fertilize themselves.
So the bacteria, they're providing a home for bacteria that does that function for them.
That's right,
And
and sort of exchange nutrients with the bacteria, because the
wow.
bacteria can't move, they can't produce energy from the sun. The plants can do that, so they trade.
Yeah. Is
And
that why
same thing with
cuts
fungus.
fungus does the same thing?
Yeah, that's like um, so all the um, mycosphere, it's often called, right? The kind of interpenetration of filaments of um, fungus underneath the root system of plants that interacts with them, trades resources, maybe even serves as a communication system. Yeah, similar setup.
Yeah. God, that's phenomenal. Is that returning to kudzu, because I know you've done quite a bit of work with that, particularly with it's more of from what I've seen online are like beautiful photos, but
Thank you.
they're they have like I don't know eeriness to them just because of the scale of like how
Mm.
the kudzu just overtakes everything. Is that part of the driver for how they can grow so massively and quickly?
Well, so much of that work, though, is to remind you that what you're seeing, though, is our disturbance that the kudzu then takes on.
Ah, yes,
Because that's
absolutely.
not that's not the way it just grows. It can only grow that when you open the forest. Say you clear a section, or on the say the roadside, right? Like, is it always a cleared area, and they can grow very quickly and get up into the say canopy. They use other plants' structure to get higher and absorb more sunlight.
And then from there, they can just go take off. They've kind of
Well,
it's like a tipping point almost.
well, the interesting thing is our perception of kudzu is because of the way it grows like a green screen in front of everything. It has to have strong sunlight, so it will not penetrate a forest because there's too much shade.
Ah,
It'll just sit on the edge. And so like you see this big wall and it's like kudzu is taking over everything. And what my writing and current research right now is about is that perception is false. All you'd have to do is look around the other side and you'd find out that the kudzu just stops.
Oh, I love that.
It's quite thin.
Yeah. That kind of gets to the idea earlier about sort of like finding an optimal disturbance. The ecosystems thrive on having some destruction,
Yeah.
but there's a balance between just like clear cutting the Amazon and creating disturbance areas where it then is able to alter and thrive in a different way.
Well, what I'm writing about right now is the relationship with the kudzu distribution you see today with the absolute deliberate and at the time ecologically valid logic of the Soil Conservation Service, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and other U.S. agencies to try to reclaim farmland that had been over-farmed. It had lost its nutrients, it had lost its topsoil, and kudzu was used and spread purposely all over the Southeast to reclaim that land, to use its nitrogen-fixing properties as free fertilizer.
Wow. Was it, and then were there then positive results from that, or did it cause kudzu to spread too much?
There's these amazing studies from the mostly the 40s, 30s, and 40s, where this is part of the New Deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Right. This is part of FDR's New Deal, the creation of the alphabet agencies, and there had been extensive farming and over farming to create cash crops, right? Cotton, tobacco, etc. And they knew, we kind of knew about soybeans and how they fix nitrogen and that they fertilize the soil a bit. And so they searched for a plant that they could propagate very easily, that would spread very quickly, that would do this for them. Now imagine this is the 30s and 40s. So most everybody is a farmer, part-time or full-time. So everybody has animals and everybody manages their farm. So there was never a concern that kudzu would get out of control because animals love it. So you could just turn your pigs or your cows or your goats out into your kudzu field and it'd be gone. Take 2 or 3 years, kudzu won't grow anymore. But what happened is, as you know, over the past 100 years is we've extensively moved to cities. And so much farmland got abandoned or unmanaged as people aged out or moved. And so some of those patches kind of just grew on their own. But they're growing on top of a disturbance, which is an old farm. But these experiments that the agricultural kind of technologists conducted showed very clearly that, yes, they increase the nitrogen, they increase the fertility of the land. And even today, it's a great fertilizer. It's a great thing to chop off, throw it on your garden. It will not grow. It only grows from the root crown underground, and it will fertilize your garden excellently.
You can just take a cutting and throw it in, and it serves that way?
Yep.
Wow.
It'd be great fertilizer. Yep.
God, I wonder if there's a future use then, no, understanding that we're kind of facing an issue with soil, I think globally even, but particularly in the U.S.,
exactly.
where it's being depleted.
Yep, we are. We are. That was its original use, and it's actually more of a remnant now. It's overrepresented in people's perception because it grows primarily along development corridors, old highways, old railways, because they planted it there. It didn't escape anything. It was planted there. And in fact, it's still doing more or less what they asked it to do, which is hold high slopes, grow in crappy, damaged, unused areas, and sort of slightly help the soil out in those areas. And it still does that today.
Wow. Yeah. Is it just the that perception of a vine that's just taking over, particularly neglected land, and then you see sort of like, I don't know, like in your imagery where it's overtaking maybe an old abandoned structure and it just has this sort of feel of the earth or Gaia cut loose, is
Yeah.
gonna crawl and pull us all down into the earth.
Yeah.
Um,
And see, I love that perception. That's what I'm playing with in those photographs because I'm trying to actually bring out that fear because we need to probe where does that fear come from? Okay, that plant is actually a quasi agricultural plant evolved for thousands of years in China and Japan to help them overcome periods of drought and famine because it
wow.
grows in marginal areas, right? So they'd always have a little food supply on the edge of their field as it goes up the mountain. Right there's the kudzu. You can eat it.
Oh,
The
really?
roots, oh yeah, the leaves are great. It's just like peas, and it is a type of pea, in fact, and its roots are heavily starchy, and you can refine that starch and use it like potato starch or anything else.
God, that's amazing. It's
So
kind of a
like this
one.
plant, so this plant that we're like assuming, right, that it's monstrously taking over nature as a wild inhabitant, in fact, is a semi domesticated, highly cultivated plant taking on disturbed spaces that we left over. And now we're scared of it.
That's crazy. Yeah. See,
And
I'm not from.
we're just eating our
So
own tail. That's all it is.
yeah. Wow. That is so wild. That the snake eating its tail too has that historical connotation of sort of like being subsumed by Mother Earth.
Yeah.
Wow. That is and it sounds like such a valuable plant too. Like I, I'm not
Extremely.
from.
Not only that, it provided extensive clothing for Chinese and Japanese sort of rural peoples for thousands of years and continues to. It's a specialty item now. Kudzu
Whoa.
cloth is very well known. You take the vine and you kind of break it down essentially by cooking it, and then you strip it out, and then you can. It's a fiber. You can weave it as you wish.
That is amazing. Is
There's this
it
old writer that called it a useful thing for useless spaces.
wow, I like that a lot. We need
Yeah,
we need things like that. I mean, there's so many useless spaces that we've created that it's good to find useful things for those spaces. That's pretty amazing.
yeah,
Wow. It sounds similar to hemp in some of the regards, just in terms of this
yeah.
ecological function and the interplay with our influence
Absolutely,
and
very
yeah.
similar. Yeah, or like jute, right? Jute is it just grows really easily. It grows really fast. It's a very durable fiber that can be used. You can feed animals with it.
Wow. So I'm from the West and I'm the landscape of the Southeast. My perception always of kudzu was that it was just this thing that had been unleashed, like a terror, and was impossible
Yep,
to get rid of.
yep. And that's the culture around it. It, in fact, is
Yeah.
very easy to get rid of. You can. There's little root crowns that grow underground, and what happens is people don't understand that they chop off the vine, and they're like, "Okay, I got rid of the vine. You can't see anything. It's done." But the root, the plant is literally adapted to that exact scenario because that's how the farmers treated it. And it will just grow very quickly right back from the root. And then they're like, it came back. I can't get rid of it. But if you just went down under the soil a little bit and cut that root crown off, it'd be gone. Or you can use animals or mechanical means and consume it over 3 or 4 growing seasons, and it will exhaust its root reserves, which is that starch that you can eat.
That's unbelievable. So is it basically sort of imported without a greater understanding of how it had been used in other places?
I, I actually think quite the opposite. I think it was imported specifically because of how productive they saw it was in Japan, particularly. Um, it was originally, the story everyone loves to tell is it was originally imported as a kind of ornamental because it grows very quickly and it's very, very hyper green, makes nice big leaves. And so you can grow it on your, say, like your porch. It'll grow up the porch and make a nice shade. And also its flowers are extremely purple and they smell like grapes in August. People love
Wow.
that. But
Yeah.
I don't like that story because it's essentially meaningless. That's actually not how it spread much. That's mostly, say, to mid-Atlantic and northeastern horticulturalists, including Olmsted. There's actually a little report of Olmsted's, I believe, his brother or cousin planting it, and there's a little remnants around the northeast of these old ornamental plantings of kudzu that didn't spread anywhere. They just sit exactly where they are because it dies in winter. You can't deal with freezing, and it just comes back from the roots. Well, in the southeast, no, like I said, the agricultural agents, and then later on the railroads in particular, planted the plant far and wide on purpose because you can eat it, you can feed it to animals, and you can make other products from it. We knew very much how it could be used.
Was it maybe a factor of the people who originally used it, the awareness of why it was brought and how it functions was lost? Or is it more of just like a myth about like it plays on our psyches in a weird way?
That's exactly right. Both of those things. Those are very good questions. I call it the ethnobotanical monster myth.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what happened. We have a kind of landscape amnesia. We forget that we destroyed all this land first. We overused it. Then we planted this plant to fix that problem. And now we're crying because we see the plant where we put it. And in fact, those are remnants of that.
And doing exactly what it was brought to do as well. And
that's
wow,
right.
That is so fascinating. Wow.
And really,
I had no idea.
It was, and yeah, like obviously humans have this grand fear of things that get out of control or out of their control. Let's say, cancer, right, is a great example. If people get concerned about migration, for example, or disease spread, and anything that operates on a kind of exponential spread spectrum, we worry that the world will be taken over. But in fact, kudzu was planted on millions of acres, and yet it actually is much smaller today than it was then. We tried to spread it everywhere, and it didn't do it.
Yeah, it sounds like we would need to. Like it would be great to have it used in more fields.
In the 30s, I call it very sound ecotech biological knowledge. It was perfectly sound logic to plant this plant to cover over environmental disturbance and massive soil erosion. That was a valid response.
Does it in those landscapes, like I just recently saw an article talking about I can't remember which state it was, maybe Iowa or somewhere like that, where they were on freeway, the landscapes along freeways, they were starting to plant patches of what's the right word? Plants that help like bees and butterflies, pollinator plants, to allow bees more places to exist.
Yep.
In landscapes like that, would kudzu overtake, like become more of a monoculture along those areas? So have a detrimental effect just in that regard, where it's displacing other plants that could come in and repopulate those spaces?
I mean, if you planted it there, probably it could outcompete most things. There's a timing issue. It's called, phenology. It's the timing of when things start to grow. So here in the mountains, for example, there are early ground plants, wildflowers, etc., that grow in the early spring that come out before kudzu comes out. And they do their thing in the early spring, and then kudzu comes and overtakes them. But sure, you wouldn't really want to spread its plantation right now. There'd be no need to.
Mm-hmm.
I would only do it in a controlled field where you wanted that product, or you had animals to control it. And the truth is that we have remnant populations aplenty that we can use and consume.
Yeah.
There's a little startup here, a nonprofit called Kudzu Culture, and they're working on essentially harvesting these old spots and using it.
That's cool. Where are you?
I'm in Western North Carolina, in the southern Appalachian region.
Oh, nice.
And my family's been here for 8+ generations.
Yeah. So you mentioned that you had grown up in the mountains. Yeah, I was curious.
Yeah.
I grew up in Colorado near the mountains as well. It does give you a different view when you can get up and see the world from above. I think in a way that living in the plains or in really dense forested areas doesn't afford.
Yeah, it goes back to this. There's this phrase, geography is destiny, right? And it informs the way we see the world, no doubt.
Oh, yeah. Color, materials, even the tones of the sky, how people dress, I don't know. I've noticed I'm in California now, but there's a difference in the light, a difference in the color of the sky, and people dress differently. And I think there's a difference in the color of the soil.
Yeah, that'd be a fun study.
Yeah, I'd be curious if there's a way to discern how much of that is cultural, just separate from location, and how much of it is infused with a place.
Yeah. Well, I think of Miami or Latin American style, and how intense the colors can be, and of course tropical plants have to compete with each other in a really broad color spectrum.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's a good comparison. I was curious. So also, I read your article about speculation in Rome, which was really cool. It just shows these repetitions of history, and comparing it with other speculative moments through time. But I guess maybe to start off with, do you mind giving sort of like a overview of that work and what you were looking at?
Yeah. If you'll remember back in 08, 07, 08, 09, it looked like the economic world was going to fall apart, right?
Yeah.
And then eventually we realized that, it was just a lot of people speculating on housing way too much.
Yeah, absolutely. And introducing new economic packages and products.
Precisely. Overusing math to hide simply bad investment decisions, right?
Mm-hmm.
Trying to distribute risk to everyone as if it just mathematically disappears, perhaps, but in the reality, it just does not.
Yeah.
And so me and my boundless curiosity, I just simply wanted to know, do humans always do this? Is this just something we do? And I started digging and digging and digging. I got back, right to say the tech bubble 2000, savings and loan crisis in the 80s, kept going back. You get the roaring 20s, the Great Depression in 1930. There's a few banking and sort of various bubbles in the late 1800s. The railroad sort of created a series of bubbles all around the world. I went back further. It's like the sailing industry, right? And the sort of the age of discovery, quote, created a series of bubbles and bubble companies. And then the things go a bit quiet for about 1,000 years there. And then I hit Rome. and I started studying villas and how Romans sort of interacted with land and how important it was. And I don't remember precisely what triggered it, but I just simply began to see a set of parallels between the Roman villa system and speculative real estate now. And I felt like maybe this was the root. And so I think my answer was that yes, humans do this. We do it whether we have extensive technology and mathematical capabilities or not. We see a resource, we consume a resource, and we speculate on the next version of that resource over and over and over.
Yeah, it's so fascinating. I also like that you referenced technology too, because at the time, that was part of the interplay there, was that they had new technologies for how to create these fish farms, basically, that were tied with the land, with the estates.
Yep.
Yeah.
And it was super sophisticated. We're talking underwater stable cement, right, to build these walls. We're talking detailed understanding of the ecological behaviors of rockfish, eels, other species that might inhabit estuaries and how they rear their young, etc. You'd need to know some of that. They specifically adapted the pools and the walls of the pool toward habitat that might support those species that they'd like to consume or sell. This one's the biggest one to me. I think it's so fascinating. They seem to have figured out conceptually that when you add some fresh water to a saltwater pond or situation, that you increase the productivity of the fish.
Seriously?
So like an estuary type of situation is the most productive for many species. Okay, so they would use the edge of the ocean to set up a habitat to attract and or just simply place the species that they'd like. They're living in these controlled pools that are dynamically refreshed with seawater because they're at a perfect level, right, for the tides. But then they would also pipe in through their well-known aqueduct infrastructural knowledge fresh water from the land and increase the productivity of these pools. It's unbelievable.
God, that is fascinating. So it's hard to, like, there's a balance there between just the brilliance of it, but then the speculative nature. So were these then just like people were just throwing money at them and it just kept leveraging and beyond almost the value of what they were farming?
Yeah. Well, obviously I'm trying to find the first example. So the first example of speculation isn't going to look like the modern example. It's not going to say move as fast. It might not have all the elements. And of course, our knowledge and documentation of the area, while thoroughly impressive, is still spotty, right? We don't know everything. Yeah. So we're having to compile some of this information from proxy information. But one issue is the size of them. So like we look at a maritime villa, and we know roughly how many people, say, would live there. We can look at the bedrooms. We can look at the bathrooms. We know how many servants might be involved to support this system. And we also know roughly, by the size of the pool and the water characteristics, the amount of production that can come out of those ponds. And it far exceeds what would be needed at the villa. So we're pretty sure that they're providing it for something else. And in fact, there's one very large one that just produces, orders of magnitude too many fish for a simple villa. And then we have these other pieces of information that we connect it to. We found boats that have what are called vivariums, so like little tanks inside the boats that clearly were to keep sea life alive. And so we think that there was a method for transferring from a maritime villa some fresh produce to, say, Rome. And then you have a market. If you have a market, then you can speculate on how much things will cost.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, one of the notes, excuse me, in there was just about how one villa had been bought at a certain price and then just sold. I think it was just
Yeah.
within years at like
Yes.
a ridiculous increase. And the person who bought it at the higher price then had multiple, I think, estates and
Yeah.
ended up facing financial ruin just from,
Precisely.
yeah.
Precisely, because Romans they're quite gossipy. They like they like a good scandal, and so they tell these stories, and we can kind of cobble together just a little bit of economic information and a little bit of sort of social connections and who sold to who, and if you string it together with the ones that have the best information, they increase in value massively. And then don't forget that there's this really unique legal situation in Rome where senators are wealthy, but they're not allowed to profit off the things that that they're legislating, which would be a really nice characteristic of our current Congress, but
Yeah.
nonetheless.
Yeah.
They actually thought about this. So that suggests investment sophistication, right? An understanding of how you would distort things if you were both legislating it and making money off of it. But land and owning property was one way that they could participate in the economy.
And actually was a requirement for being in the Senate as well, right?
Precisely.
Was that you were a landholder of a
Precisely.
certain economic status?
That's right.
Yeah. But they were restricted from like getting involved in their banking system and other aspects.
Like active,
Yeah.
trade.
Wow. One of the other dynamics that I thought was interesting was that it seemed to grow as the empire grew. So so there's an interplay maybe implied between speculation and empire, and also slavery.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Again, you have to kind of cobble it together. But these pools with all those sophisticated technologies I talked about, you can find them in Egypt. You can find them on the North African coast and other spots, in Spain, in France. So anywhere Romans were, we have this tech. And it's hard to see that the tech is solely to provide local produce, because you can, of course, you have fishermen that are just going out and fishing the normal way. And no doubt the ocean was quite bountiful for the population. This is an attempt to concentrate it, right? And this is a huge thing that we do as humans. We concentrate material.
Mm-hmm.
Usually to deleterious effect, but nonetheless, it's what we do.
And put like an efficiency move. It's a striving for efficiency and
Yep.
Like it concentrated and movable. Really, it's so interesting. And
but to connect to the two other stories, right? Kudzu, the plant, concentrates nitrogen and these bacteria in its roots. Mammoth concentrate, we think perhaps, the growth of forbs and herbaceous and nutritious species by eating them and pooping them. So in some ways, we all concentrate what we survive on.
Yeah. I guess then it's just a question of when the financial motives start to overrun the value generation of it.
Yep.
Or
that and how dynamically connected it is to its resource source, right? So if you can't see how, if the effects are externalized, they're placed somewhere else, you can't see that, in fact, you're polluting your own pond, right? Is the way it would go.
Yeah. Well, that's it. So that's another aspect. Like you'd mentioned the speculative bubbles with like the overseas shipbuilding and movements, which to me also kind of relates to the imperial aspect and even expansion of cities or causing the suburban push or expansion of the railroads. It's a, they've evolved around this outward, you know, tapping into resources from farther away and
Yep.
concentrating the gains and
Yep.
sort of feeding that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. It's similar things over and over and over through history. Yeah.
Yeah, and now you have just derived why I started my asteroid project.
Yes, yeah, that was the other one that I was really curious. Mining of asteroids. It was, for one, just seeing how much is already being done. That like you had mentioned, I think it was a Japanese probe. I'm forgetting the name of it that's already gone and brought material back.
Yep. Yeah,
And
Hayabusa has already dropped its material in Australia, and they picked it up. It's amazing.
Yeah, and now there's private agencies, private entities getting involved in doing similar private businesses, I guess.
They're trying to.
Yeah.
Of course, it's very expensive, very speculative, and very
Yeah.
difficult. And then NASA has its own projects, of course.
God, that's wild.
Osiris Rex has already obtained its sample from Bennu, an asteroid, and it's coming back now. And in fact, I think not too long ago, just a few months, found a new asteroid that's going to pass by Earth quite near, like within 19,000 kilometers, I think. And so like 1/10 of the way to the moon. And thus that presents an opportunity for us to check its materials as it whizzes by. And so I believe Osiris Rex is going to attempt to collect another sample from that asteroid now.
That is just so wild. Are we able to sort of, from afar, guess at what these asteroids may have, just based on like light or their movement or their mass, just anything?
I mean, like all the above. It also, their trajectory in terms of their orbit tells us a little bit about their origin, their shape. We can see if they were ejected and like kind of exploded right in the early actual universe. We think this new one is called Apophis, Apophis. We think it is one of these early explosion sort of artifacts, and that will mean certain things about its composition, precisely.
Wow. How do we? I mean, are we actually landing on them to get the samples?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
That is so mind blowing to me.
Yep.
Wow. So, based on what has been delivered from, or even let's stick with the U.S. example. It's called Osiris.
Osiris Rex is the name of the vehicle.
Having collected the sample, do we already kind of know what it's bringing, or will we not know until it's actually dropped?
We only know the kind of like, principled, we think it's this type of asteroid. It's roughly made up of these types of elements, but it doesn't transmit any information other than obtained sample, sample weighs 3 grams or whatever, those types of things. That we know. And then when we get it back, they'll go crazy attempting to assess every minute potential of this material, both for science but also for speculation.
Yes, yeah, that was what I was. So, I was curious. I was looking online a little bit, and so there's the side of it that's looking at it just scientifically, learning more about the history of the universe, of whatever can be extracted scientifically about the space and us, humanity, how we ended up here, anything. But then just a pure resource grab, potentially. Yeah. You find a hunk of gold out there that's, like more gold than we've ever harvested, by like a magnitude of 10 or something. And
definitely.
It completely changes. Or even just use too, just for, I don't know, it's like material applications, like products, just having
Exactly.
raw resources. Yeah,
Yep.
it's interesting. So we're just basically waiting for a care package almost from space.
Yep.
Yeah,
It's an unbelievable operation, and they should really be lauded for this. Like, I consider it just as impressive as a moon landing, personally. I really do.
well, it sounds way more technical.
I mean, it is like so much about, of course, when we put humans or biological beings inside of something, there's just all these complexities that entails. And I not trying to undermine that achievement. Those are unbelievable too.
Yeah.
But yeah, we're going further, really detailed operations, and they're executed pretty well each time. I'm very impressed.
Yeah, one of the things about the Japanese one that I read is that it actually, like, it just dumps the capsule, which comes in through the atmosphere and lands, but it's still continuing out. It's not like itself
Yeah,
returns, which is
yeah. I
super
mean,
cool.
exactly. Anything that goes into space, you got to be very careful, right? You don't want to waste anything because it's so expensive to get it up there. Payload capacity is very limited, and if it can continue to do any type of service, leave it up there. And then, of
Yeah.
course, it's dangerous to bring it into the atmosphere because it
Hmm.
explodes and rains on people.
Oh yeah, yeah, that's a good point. But that one, it's actually, it went from one asteroid and now it's going off to another one, I believe. Is that the same
Mhm.
with Osiris Rex? They'll send it. It'll
Exactly,
go to one and
exactly.
then drop it off and
That's
then
the plan anyway. Yeah.
wow, so fascinating.
Like another recent discovery is there's a material that we know, I believe, is in meteorites, is why we know it, and we assume it's in asteroids, potentially, um, called tetratanite, and it has these very special properties. It's a kind of iron nickel alloy, and it has high magnetism, and it very stable, I think, and so it can replace some of the rare earths that we need so desperately for electric vehicle rollout, for batteries, for devices, etc. And that's one of the reasons we're looking into sort of space objects to see how much of this material they have. But recently, we a group of scientists, I think two independent groups of scientists, did um, artificially produce this material, and either through extraction from asteroids or through artificial production, if we can do this, it totally changes the rare earth problem, which
Oh
requires dependence on China. It requires a very dangerous mining and unfortunate, sort of environmental effects of that mining.
yeah, well, that's also in the big climate change dialogue. Battery capacity and the ability to even transfer to passive energy
Mm-hmm.
sources, we just don't even, there's just no way on earth that we have the quantity needed to be able to meet our current needs, particularly, let alone future
Yep.
needs. If so, that'd be completely fascinating to come across a source off earth that enables for sustainable
Yeah.
energy methods on earth. That's, yeah, that
Mm-hmm.
would be a complete game changer. Yeah. And those rare earth mining operations are pretty savage from what I understand, just human rights
Well,
and earth.
it's just one of those like sad realities about the world. Their rare earths are actually not rare. They're quite common, but they're distributed very thinly in Earth's crust. So we
Mm-hmm.
have to mine a big volume to get a small amount of rare earths by refining, right? Back to concentration of
Yeah.
material.
God, that's, yeah. So you'd have to just go, I mean, so to gather more, you have to impact greater and greater areas
Precisely.
as opposed to just
Precisely.
one concentrated location that could
Yeah.
provide everybody. Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh man. Yeah, that was fascinating. So the I have it here, the article with the images of, find the right page, the
Yeah.
different quantities that could be potentially harvested.
Yeah. I mean, the numbers are just inconceivable.
Yeah, a quadrillion.
And that was my point. It's like,
Yeah.
that's why even a remote chance of getting this material is worth investigating, because the impact was just unbelievable.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I mean, I never really considered, like how many problems could be solved. I was
Mhm.
thinking of it more in just in terms of like people trying to get rich, but when you think of
Let's do
the
both.
solutions, yeah, yeah. I mean, it could make all of humanity, prosperous
Precisely.
in an
So
entirely new way.
this is an example of, this is a big part of my thought process. It's huge, and it's very hard to explain, I think, in general, but it's this idea of unintended consequences. And instead of having them unintended, have them designed,
Yeah,
so that
absolutely.
the fallout from what you do somehow benefits the world, right? So by introducing mega herbivores, we actually end up diversifying the grasslands, right? Or if we happen to find these highly valuable minerals, we can potentially significantly reduce the footprint of mining on Earth.
Yeah, that would be so astonishing. I mean, and then what you can do with the land that previously had been mined.
Yeah,
Um,
it's huge,
yeah,
huge.
yeah, that was one of the interesting aspects of the speculation studies too. Is just that the impacts are seen, 2,000 years later. Like
Hmm.
the mark on the land is etched, and
Yeah, and I mean, I give the Romans really high credit for that, because what they're doing is not toxic. What they're doing is not particularly problematic. It's just a kind of rearranging of the flow a bit.
mhm.
And
And they were
that's a real lesson.
oh, absolutely, yeah. And they were wanting the fish to be happy. That was one of
Yeah.
the notes as well, that they were studying ways to provide the
Yeah.
nooks and crannies that they like, and
Hmm.
yeah, that was cool. Yeah. Um, oh, and then the other aspect too was the even just the term funded. That fund has come from that
Yeah.
history of fundus, meaning like a farming estate. Um,
Yeah. I've
I thought,
I've never heard anybody write that, and I came across it as I was studying it, and I just had this kind of economic mindset while I was doing it. It just hit me that, oh yeah, this is the origin of the term fundus, um, and that really brings it home that this is a economically minded operation.
yes,
Yes,
yeah,
they needed to feed themselves, but they were doing it so effectively, so broad, with such advanced tech for the day, that that no doubt it was being thought of more broadly than simply as food.
yes, yeah, and the implication of it being like a source. It's like a fund that is actually
Yeah,
providing.
yeah, absolutely.
Now they seem so extractive, almost like private
Yeah,
equity or something. It's just this
yeah,
extractive thing that's pulling money out of the system. But
hmm,
when you look at the etymology, it's really cool. I don't know,
yeah,
and it does show this connection that through the years that we've been doing the same stuff for eons in
yeah.
various forms. Yeah, no, I really like that. I think we covered a lot of what I had written down. But I'm curious too. So you just had mentioned that you're um, from Appalachia and the 8 generations,
Hmm.
and so maybe just some talking a little bit more about you how you came up and your interests, and
Hmm.
maybe how they've brought you to the where you're at now or have contributed.
Yeah, I mean, I think that One is being from a subculture inside of America is always pretty dynamic for me personally because I knew a different system. So when I go out and say, went to school in the north and dealt and lived in an urban system that operates very differently than a rural system that I'm from. Also flat systems, say coastal or plain systems versus the mountain system, right? Where you're always struggling against slope here, always.
Huh.
Third, my father operated a landfill. So I was used to thinking of how land changes and how you entomb things in the land and how you manage the potential impacts, right, of the collapse of a slope or the waste, right, and how it needs to be, you need to separate water systems from waste systems. I saw that since I was a young child. And then I come from and I am surrounded by farmers and ranchers. And so I'm used to people evaluating natural systems and resource systems that support you economically, but also nutritionally and also culturally, and that they all intertangle and interrelate. And I think all of those things influenced me, no doubt.
Yeah. The idea of constantly confronting topography is so interesting. Being in a mountain environment, I had never considered, and absolutely that would have it would be a factor in the cultural and psychological, I don't know, development of societies in those places.
Yeah, and you have a kind of natural upbringing in seeing ecology occur, right? Because we're used to looking at the zonation up the mountain, right? It's very different up here. The mountains in the southern Appalachians, you have the tallest mountains in the east, and at the top, it's like Canada. It's cold. The species are, pine forest, etc. The mammals, they're some of the tiny remnant populations of mammals that came down during the last glacial age. This whole area was an ecological refugium for all the species from the north. This was the extent of glaciation. We just had little proto-glaciers here, and that was it. Everything else was still functional. In the meantime, in the warm times, this place becomes subtropical, and it's almost like a rainforest. So we have rhododendron and, thick, evergreen, slick vegetation that's much more like tropical vegetation.
God, that's amazing.
The rainfall, can be quite intense.
Yeah.
Also here, everything's hidden. Everything's difficult, right? The rocks, the water, the slope, and you have to negotiate all that to know how to build, to how to travel, how to have a good time. I mean, look, I built a lot of bike ramps in my life, and I didn't have to build much because I had slope everywhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So I read this book in the past, and it was largely about Southeast Asia, but it was called The Art of Not Being Governed, and it spoke a lot about populations. As let's say like in Thailand and Cambodia and some of these areas where you'd have a kingdom that's sort of taking control of other kingdoms around it. Mm-hmm. People that would resist that rule often went to the mountains in those locations and grew different plants or different agriculture because rice was part of settling people on the land. And they had different ways of living, and they specifically used the mountains as a way to maintain a sense of autonomy. Do you find that it's a similar cultural history there where it's a desire to be free and autonomous, and the landscape was the settlement of these places was part of that was part of the equation?
I think that's a great intercultural parallel. I think that's lovely. And yes, I do know that occurs in, say, Southeast Asia. And here, that is absolutely true. There's a fierce independent strike in people here. And they're not from one group. They are Scotch-Irish who were already essentially booted out of England, right? And
Yep.
forced to live. And then they left, came to America, and they kept searching the seaboard and eventually came inland to the mountains where they could live on their own and just live amongst their own principles. Some sort of religious persecuted peoples out of Germany, out of Netherlands, out of Scandinavia also came here. And I descend from all those peoples. You can see it in my genetics.
Yes.
But I believe that the culture absolutely not only inherited that independent spirit, they sought out this geography because of it. And then it concentrated while it was here.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. That's part of that interplay between culture and your surroundings,
Yeah.
your
Yeah,
environment.
your physiogeography. Yeah,
Yeah. No,
absolutely.
that's
Um,
so fascinating.
people do not in Southern Appalachia, right? You don't waste anything. You keep everything. You reuse it. You repurpose it. You use all spare items, all spare food. There's all kinds of there's food systems that use leftovers, for example. Yeah, it's part of the mentality deeply.
Oh, that is so great. It's a part of the mentality that is, I believe, would be hugely important for the rest of us to adhere, to
Yeah.
learn and adopt, because particularly now it's just, it seems like everything is approached in a very disposable way. And
Yeah.
yeah, and not even just like the wastage aspect of it. It's just there's like an appreciation for having, you
Mm.
don't you don't let go of something so easily. In that, I was raised that way as well. I thought a lot of it out of necessity, but
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah, there's just it's a good value. Let's say I
Yeah.
believe. Yeah. Um,
Yeah. Many people argue that they didn't know they were poor here, right? Because there wasn't some other representation that would indicate how bad off they were. They had food. The weather is mostly good here. It's a little bit dangerous in the winter, but the land provides. Water is generally available, and because they had all these technological and cultural advancements to take advantage of it, they felt, supported more or less. Maybe they weren't materially rich, but they were landscape rich. That's how I grew up.
yeah, yeah. That also says a lot about the culture as well, in that maybe people that did have more, it's still like a tight knit society where there's not a separation, like, oh, look at, like, what's it called, like, there's a Marxist term for it, but like showing your status through your
Yeah,
material goods,
yeah,
and sort
like
of like trying to
yeah, yeah.
separate yourself by
Hmm.
material wealth, but like a
And
sense
and
of
and
being in
look,
it with everybody.
yeah, and those processes occurred here. I'm not suggesting they didn't. There's
Hmm.
cities here and towns, of course, where people organize by status, no doubt. Um, but I think I like to at least try to explicate for the rest of Americans some hidden things about Appalachia that they don't know. Um,
Yeah.
the sophistication of the survival strategy that the culture developed in a way that supported life here. And I think they just see it as impoverished and they miss out on those other aspects.
Oh yeah, yeah. No, I think that is good too. I appreciate that. It is a culture that I don't know that there's a more um, deeply rooted culture in the U.S. Like,
Yeah.
if you kind of just think of regions or subcultures, it's
Yeah.
among the most widely known.
Yeah.
Which is amazing.
Well,
Because
and it's quite old. Like a lot of people don't know that Hernando de Soto and Juan Pardo made expeditions into these mountains in the 1500s.
Really?
Yes, there's artifacts.
God, no, I had no sense. And so there's layers of probably immigration waves, like the time of when the Irish were coming and when the Germans were coming, and
Exactly.
wow, yeah,
And it's most of those waves are pre-revolution. They're quite old. And
yeah,
then this area still acted like a frontier because each new mountainous valley was a new frontier, sort of unto itself. While the rest of the nation, say, developed, Chicago opens up, the rails opens up the West, and you get big cities like San Francisco even by the 1870s. In the 1870s, San Francisco probably had more infrastructure than right here,
oh,
even though
I
this
believe
is East
that.
Coast and had been inhabited a long time. But it's very difficult here, like I said. Rail came into the place I live in 1885.
Wow, that's pretty amazing. So did you grew up in interplay between like an urban context and that sort of like open space and wilderness?
Um, I would definitely say, much like the West, much like Colorado, where you're from, where you have these vast tracts of federal protected land. Here, it's mostly forest, mountainous forest, and then the
Yeah,
little valleys are occupied by infrastructure, people, towns, etc. And so it's a
yeah,
mixture. Yeah,
yeah. No, I grew up in a town. It was maybe like 100,000 people, but my high school, we had people that came from ranches and other people from farms and
yeah,
people that lived up in the mountain valley. That they were a little bit more hippie, but it was this
hmm
whole mix. And when I was there, my years, we got along so well. It was just a mishmash of all these people that had
cool.
totally different stories, and it just
Yeah.
it created a really great um, I don't know, environment to grow up in, and really grew up with really great and interesting people. And
You mean
I,
it's not like South Park?
well, maybe in some ways, yeah, yeah, I won't deny that, yeah. But no, it's just, yeah, there's something about having, I think, access to open land too, because
I
I mean,
think
we'd
so.
just go off and like
Yeah,
have huge parties in the mountains, but it was just
yeah.
nobody was causing trouble because we could go escape.
Yeah, I hiked. I mean, I'm looking at the mountains outside my window where I hiked as a kid. I just wandered, discovered things, watched species change, watched the seasons change.
God, that's great. One of my professors in school said that a lot of landscape architects grow up and they have access to these undesigned spaces. It's not necessarily like pure, raw wilderness, although that could be
Yeah,
the case too, but
yeah.
sort of those,
Interface.
yeah. And that I don't know the research or where
Yeah,
he's quoting, but I find it interesting. And the more
it'd be
landscape
interesting to
architects,
know. Yeah, it'd be
yeah,
interesting to know. It would explain the impoverishment of the profession now because there's less of those spaces.
do you feel that it is like that the profession is kind of becoming impoverished, like in terms of thinking or like creativity?
I really do. I think it's thoroughly diminished, especially from the Olmsted days. Um, like you go through mid-century, the 1900s, where you extensively professionalize the the study of landscape architecture, right? And it gets tangled inside wealthy circles pretty tightly, I think,
Yeah,
um, and therefore absorbs many of the sort of dumbing down and simplification of the capitalist system, right? We've lost a lot of big ideas. You hear it talked about a little bit, but it's not really in the curriculum.
yeah, yeah,
It's very few people publish on it. Like, as you can see, I mostly publish in other areas, right? I publish in economics or I publish in ecology or whatever. because landscape doesn't really typically absorb that information anymore. There's a few bright spots out there, no doubt. I'm not trying to suggest there's none. But I do think it's suffered tremendously.
Yeah. You know what I get a sense is that I don't know. I went to Colorado State for landscape architecture, and the professors there were amazing when I came through, particularly for
Cool.
a state school, and we were allowed to explore kind of any ideas. Like we had some pretty free reign. You're taught a lot of the sort of like man versus nature stuff, which over time I kind of questioned, but in terms of our design exploration, it was very free. And I think the sense I'm getting, I haven't kept up, but is that universities in general are becoming more dogmatic. And in a design school, a lot of it's going to be like, these are the main issues and we all approach them from the same way. And we don't question sort of like some of the founding basis of it. And yeah, it just seems very regimented.
Yeah, I'm roughly encapsulating in the term professionalization, right? That they're essentially training CAD monkeys to go out there and produce standardized projects. And there's, again, bright spots that don't do that. I don't deny that. A lot of times, like in school, in say graduate school in landscape, a lot of times you'll see a division between two groups of students. And it depends on what disciplinary knowledge they're bringing to their graduate experience. So what did they come from, right? And I would hope it's always diverse. That's always excellent. Of course, I prefer it that way. But sometimes when they have not studied, say, more environmental or large-scale geology, earth and ocean science, ecology, some of those disciplines, if they have not studied those, they're not going to get it inside of landscape architecture. But yet those knowledge bases are so necessary to do it right. And you just
absolutely.
see a sad kind of, they may not quite ever get it because they didn't, the profession's not going to give it to them.
No. And you go and work in an office, it's rare that those factors even come into play.
Exactly. And that's that's sad. That is an impoverished state, because to not understand how the land comes about and then to operate on top of it is naive and dangerous, in my opinion.
I agree. Yeah, I do. And also, the 21st century, there's so many issues, and we could be like the pioneers. We should be the pioneers in how to address these things. It's like a huge opportunity that we're just like not even coming close to trying to grab and like, hey, we can do this, We're the people that should be doing this. And I don't know. That's part of why I wanted to even just have these conversations, because hopefully there's a way to just move the dialogue forward. I don't know. I've looked out in the overall podcasting landscape, and it doesn't seem like they're very design focused, what I'm seeing. Just beauty and aesthetics in a sense, and to bring people that are addressing the issues in a variety of different fields into a hub where you can talk about some of the most cutting edge approaches. I would love to do that, but I think the profession at large is missing that opportunity.
Absolutely.
Well, I think I don't want to hold you for too much longer, but I've really enjoyed talking with you and looking at your work, and it's been really great. I appreciate you coming on and doing this with me.
Thank you. Thanks for having this format. I appreciate your breadth. I mean, you clearly get these connections that, we need to be making everything from a small, tiny, local design office through your big firms all the way up to the policy level. I'd like to see a lot more of our type of thinker at the policy level, in the big meetings, informing everyone about unintended consequences and ecological connections, etc.
So true. Yeah. That is true. I wonder even just how to go about that. But yeah, that would be phenomenal. For one, to have landscape architects that are on that level in the broader, in what their knowledge base is, that it's this expansive systems view. But then to be in the table with the big decision makers, yeah. I mean, so frequently it's just, we're hired by developers, and
Yeah.
that's mainly what the landscape architecture world is, like a service, that we provide.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, and I think that's inverse from the way that I have always thought about it. You need to be pretty entrepreneurial, right? You need to identify the problem, then you start. You've got to be overeducated on it. By the way, like you have to know more than everyone does about whatever it is that you think needs to be attacked, and you got to look at it from every angle, from the scientific, from the social, from an economic, etc. And then you, in my opinion, you start publishing on it is one method.
yeah,
Everything from local papers all the way up to books, etc. And that gets that attention light on it, right? And then you get on a format like yours or some news organization, it broadens it, gets everybody interested a little bit. That begins to draw the funding, and then maybe you can make it happen.
that's a really good outline. Actually, that's another question I have is, you seem to be operating in an entirely distinct world. Like I haven't, I've been doing research on like different people, and you just, it's like, I don't know, it's you. Like you have this space and you do all these things, and I was really curious about that. Like even just how to like survive.
I am most certainly probably call it a freak. I maybe it's the Appalachian mountaineer in me. I just think I need to be completely self-supportive.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah,
I have to do it all myself so that I can see it and so that I can understand it. But there's another. I said self-supportive, and the other side of that coin is I am not particularly supported from other systems. Right? I have to build it myself. I have to convince sometimes governments, sometimes organizations, sometimes companies, whoever, that I've got something that they don't have, that they're not covering. And part of the way you have to do that is to be over prepared. I read extensively. I call it horizon scanning, right? I will scan so broad on a subject.
yeah.
To be sure that my preparation is just beyond what anyone else would do. And it helps, but at times it makes it hard to even communicate what I know, right? Because I can talk to an engineer over here about these technical aspects, or I can talk to the policy guy over here about what they're struggling with, but rarely can I do both.
Yeah, I understand that. Yeah, it's so hard sometimes when you're operating in just a number of different spheres. It's hard to convey that you can be speaking with one person, but they won't understand all the other stuff that comes into play. You meet them where they're at, but there's this whole
Yeah.
I don't know, not bag, but there's just this whole breadth of knowledge and awareness that comes with that. And you can speak to an engineer about an engineering problem, but they're not going to grasp that you're also bringing in the ecosystem and the other thing that feeds into and has value in that specific arena.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm saying it very well, but
no, absolutely. And that's part of what hamstrings landscape, right? That we have to be generalist. You have to have broad expertise in multiple arenas, or you just won't be able to push anything forward. I like to think of it like I'm an octopus, right? If you don't know about octopi actually, they, in each leg, in each extension, there are ganglion, bundles of nerves that can operate independently, right, and make decisions. Each arm can. So they have 8 times, right, the exploration capability. And so you have to do that, right? You have to put yourself in extended areas and have your little triggers in those different arenas about your project or about the issue that you're trying to push forward on.
Yeah. No, that's a good metaphor.
And speaking on what you said about sort of operating in a space that just kind of doesn't exist, that really is true. And that's why I think the term that I've rallied around currently is landscape futurist. Because mostly what I do is try to assess the landscape future. And that landscape isn't necessarily grass and trees. It may very well be urban systems. It may very well be mining systems. It may be in outer space. But the principles and the organizational sort of characteristics and the different disciplines that I have to draw on, that repeats. That's true of every single project. So that's why I typically have labeled myself the landscape futurist.
I like that term a lot. I just spoke with Matthew Gandy. He's a geographer in the UK.
Yeah.
And he spoke about, I asked him about, what is a city? And he wanted to clarify the difference between the actual node, the urban node, and this process of urbanization that creates what could be called like an urban landscape out on the mine or the forest that's being harvested, where you have the influence of resource extraction, or it's still part of the urbanization process. And so he would still consider that like an urban landscape. And I think it goes towards what you're talking about, where this bigger picture view of the world that we're shaping, the term landscape also applies to these future spaces and the current impacts and where they're going. And it's not just like a city thing or like a specific patch of land. It's these much bigger, frontiers or areas.
Yep. Yeah. Many people don't understand how fraught the definitionary issues are around urban and rural divides. It's very complicated. It's not a binary 1-0, right? And maybe even the most interesting part is that interface that we've talked about, right? That where the urban systems begin to play out, but they haven't taken over the wild or more intact flowing systems, right? Yeah. Because usually when you obstruct a flow, that's usually where you end up with environmental problems, right?
That's a good way. That's a good way of putting it.
Yeah. And like another example is one of the definitions for urbanization or urban areas is just simply population density. And that works in a lot of scenarios because where people are, they have impacts. Where people are, they have infrastructures. But what about an airport? Right? That's a massive imposition on a system. And there's no people that live there, not one. Industrial areas are the same issues. Or say like a far off agricultural or water resource that an urban system draws on. Yes, I absolutely agree with the definition that those are urbanistic or urban influenced areas. And much of the earth is at this point, despite the fact that our urbanized footprint is not necessarily that large.
Yes, yeah. It's hard to find anything. I mean, I don't know if there's one patch of land that hasn't been impacted by.
Not much. Not in terms of like, say, plastic pollutions or forever chemicals, PFAS chemicals. Microplastics are everywhere. We find them in all organisms. One of the fascinating things about the Roman system, you could trace the production of coinage in Rome by looking at ice cores in Greenland.
Seriously?
Yep.
Because of the smelting and the working with the metal had off, it caused its own pollution.
Yep.
And then
say lead, for example, you could trace. And there shouldn't be that amount of lead in those ice cores. And so you can watch it change, and that is a register of Roman economic change. So it's like the stock market of Rome, right? You can watch it.
That is astounding. God, that goes back to the idea of how long human influence has been at play on Earth. This idea of when is
Exactly.
yeah. My goodness. Well, yeah, this has been, I don't know, it's been really great talking with you. And
You
yeah,
too.
I look forward to seeing the work that you continue to do. And um, I don't know, reach out anytime if the
Yeah,
need so arises. I'd love to keep in touch.
absolutely. You too.
Yeah.
You're in San Diego or?
I'm in San Francisco. I'm in
Oh, San
Marin, just
Francisco.
north of the Bay. Yeah. I used
Okay.
to, I have a history in San Diego, but
Okay.
yeah, I've moved to the Bay now. But
Cool.
yeah, it'd be
Well,
good to
listen,
stay in touch.
yeah, and if you're ever out here in North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, Tennessee, anywhere, I'm around.
I'll be happy to. Yeah, I'll let you know if I head that way. And likewise, if you ever are on the West Coast.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, yeah. Well, yeah. Thanks again. It's been really nice talking with you, and yeah,
You as well.
I wish you the best, and yeah, look forward to what the future has in store.
You too. Take care. Talk to you
All
soon.
right, all right. Take care. Thanks.